Hello, and thanks for joining us here today for an introduction into the native bees in Maryland. My name is Sarah Yashua, and I've been a Baltimore County Master Gardener since 2014. And it was through this program that I learned how essential insects are as part of a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And I also discovered that many of our most beneficial bugs are in decline. With the Master Gardener pollination team, we reach out to the community and we explain the importance of the pollinators for our gardens, for our landscapes, and for our food supply as well. Without our pollinators, most of our flowering plants would be in jeopardy. And this includes many of our most nutritious and delicious foods, such as our fruits, our nuts, our berries, and many of our vegetables. Our dinner plates would be so boring without our pollinators. So it's very important that we all learn how to manage our landscapes in a way that supports those pollinators so they can keep doing that very important job, not just for us, but for our children, our grandchildren, and many generations yet to come. So let's get started. For anybody who's not familiar with the Master Gardeners, it's a University of Maryland extension program under the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources that takes that science-based knowledge from the university about sustainable gardening and landscape management practices. And we make that information available to everyone in the local community through various outreach programs. So if you're interested in learning more about us or about the other extension programs, or if you have questions or want advice about your gardens or your landscapes, then please visit the University of Maryland Extension website. Today, we're going to talk about the native bees in our area. Who are they? Where are they? Why are they important? What they need to survive. We'll touch briefly on the threats to their survival, and then we'll finally discuss how each and every one of us can help promote healthy bees. When most people think about bees, they think about European honeybees. Honeybees are domesticated insects that are essential for our large-scale agriculture today. And even though honeybees have been here for hundreds of years as an agricultural species, they didn't co-evolve with the local ecosystems, and they're not native to North America. So we're not going to be talking about them much today, except maybe to compare them with our native bees. There are about 450 species of native bees here in Maryland alone that have been essential for the reproduction of our flowering plants for over 100 million years. And most of our native bees are gentle, solitary, ground-nesting bees that are drastically different from everything you've heard about the European honeybees. There's no hive with a single queen and tens of thousands of hardworking daughters. There's no waggle dance giving directions to good food sources perhaps miles away. There are no huge honey stores, and there's no venomous barbed stinger. Our solitary native bees are very unlikely to sting. They're programmed for flight before fight. Up to 90% of the flowering plant species depend on animals for transferring their pollen, and that's almost exclusively insects. Of course, the insects visit the flowers for food. The nectar provides sugars for energy, and the sole purpose for the plant to produce nectar is to attract pollinating animals to visit their blooms, kind of like the payment that the plant makes for having its pollen personally delivered. Pollen is also very nutritious. It's got protein, essential amino acids, fats, and carbs. And in the case of our bees, turns out it's a perfect baby food. You probably already know that pollination occurs when the grains of male pollen sticks to the pollinators it forages for food and is transferred to the sticky female stigma on a flower in the same species. That movement of pollen within the same flower or the same plant is called self-pollination. And many of our plants are self-sterile, and they've developed strategies to prevent that fertilization of the ovules from the same plant. That movement of pollen to a flower on a different plant in the same species is called cross-pollination. And it's this mixing of genes from cross-pollination that results in more vigorous plants that are able to adapt to changing conditions. And what we're going to learn about today is how bees are especially good at providing those cross-pollination services. All the flowering plants compete to attract the pollinators to visit their flowers. And the traits of the different flowers, such as their size, their shape, their color, their scent, and even their time of bloom are referred to as pollinator syndromes. And these flower traits have co-evolved with their pollinators for over 100 million years to attract a specific group of pollinators, which increases the likelihood that a pollinator is going to visit another flower in the same species. The very earliest angiosperms, which are, of course, our flowering plants, were very simple flowers that attracted beetles. Then, the coevolution between plants and insects has resulted in this incredible diversity of species we have in both our flowering plants and our insects. Changes in plants triggered adaptations in the insects, and changes in insects triggered adaptations in the flowering plants. A good example of that selective adaptation would be the deep red tubular blooms that attract hummingbirds, but few insects can reach the nectar reward deep inside. Bees easily perceive colors in the blue and yellow end of the spectrum, so flowers that are bright white, yellow, blue, or purple are most attractive to them. The red flowers are going to appear almost black to bees. However, they're still going to be very attracted to the yellow disc flowers in the zinnia or the stark white anthers in the poppy that you see here. They may also be attracted to a floral or sweet scent. Nectar guides are visual cues leading down to a nectar source that can be a contrasting color, such as you see in the iris in the video, or they could be ultraviolet, which is clearly visible to a bee's vision. This black-eyed Susan, under a UV light, reveals those dark ultraviolet nectar guides leading down to the nectaries. Once fertilized, flowers stop producing nectar and may change color to signal to the pollinator that there is no more food. This aster was in mid-November, and if you can see, there's one cluster of flowers that still has that vibrant yellow color, and apparently it's still producing nectar because those mast bees are all over it. Bees are the best pollinators for several reasons. First off, bees tend to be hairy, which aids in transferring the pollen between the flowers. They also generate a positive charge while flying that attracts the negatively charged pollen. Sometimes it can jump right off and stick to them all over. Many of our bee species, especially our bumblebees, are flower constant, which means they tend to visit one particular species of plant on any single foraging trip, which again greatly improves the likelihood of successful cross-pollination. Almost all of our female bees have an area of special branched hairs on their body that's called a scopa, which is specifically for collecting and transporting pollen. And that scopa hair is usually going to be on their hind legs. And when they have long hairs on their hind legs, like on this sweat bee, they could be called pollen brushes. There's also a family of bee that has her scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen. Here we have a leafcutter bee, and you can see the hairs. There are scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen. Here's one that's fully loaded and was caught on her way back to her nest. Bumblebees and honeybees have pollen baskets on their hind legs that are called corbiculae. And these are indentations that are surrounded by those bristly branched hairs. They moisten the pollen with nectar and saliva before packing it into these pollen baskets, and it really holds fast. The main reason why bees are the best pollinators is because they collect pollen to take back to their nest to feed their young. All bee larvae eat pollen, and with few exceptions, our adult female bees are built to gather it. And it's this foraging for their nest provisions that makes bees the most successful pollinators of all. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, native bees are responsible for pollinating about 80% of the flowering plants around the world. Most of our bees are generalist foragers that'll collect pollen and nectar from almost any good source. But over a quarter of our native bee species are specialists that will only forage for pollen to raise their young from specific plant species or a small number of related plants. A couple examples of specialist bees would be this evening primrose sweat bee. It's the Lasioglassum oenothera. Will only forage on plants in the Oenothera genus. And my personal favorite bee of all time is this tiny spring beauty mining bee. This is the Andrena irrigenia, that she's only going to collect pollen and nectar from the spring beauty wildflowers. And just look at all that beautiful pink pollen that she has covering her pollen baskets. Oh, the pollen brushes in this case, I'm sorry. The specialists are very beneficial to the plants, but there's added risk to the bee survival because if the plant is lost, then the bee's going to disappear as well. Bees live anywhere there are flowers offering nectar and pollen, and our native bees range in size from the tiny perdita at about 1/8 of an inch up to the size of a large carpenter bee at just around 1 inch. And how far that bee will travel from its nest for forage for provisions is mostly dependent on the size of the bee. That large carpenter bee can forage for well over a mile from the nest, whereas the tiny perdita is only going to travel a couple of 100 feet, like perhaps just across your backyard. The males don't sting, they don't have the equipment, and most of our solitary female bees will only sting as an absolute last resort. And no bees or wasps will sting on flowers because they don't defend the flowers. And you probably already know that the females do all the work collecting their pollen. All bees are complete insects that go through 4 stages in life. They start out as an egg and then will hatch into a larva. Then they go into a pupa stage, and there they'll go through metamorphosis into their adult form. The adults from the previous generation don't usually come into contact with their offspring. The most immature bees receive no parental care beyond the pollen and nectar supplied in their brood cell. And most of our native bee species have a 1-year life cycle, and they're going to remain dormant through the winter in that natal nest. The female provisions each brood cell with a mixture of pollen and nectar that's called bee bread, onto which she lays a single egg before sealing the cell and then moving on to supply the next one. 1 to 5 days after the egg is laid, a soft grub-like larva emerges. All the bees' growth occurs in this stage, and as they expand from eating that bee bread, they're going to increase in size about 150 times. They're going to grow too big for their skin, and they'll molt out of that exoskeleton 4 or 5 times. And yes, that's a face only a mother could love, but remember that the bees spend their entire development side inside their sealed brood cell. After the final molt, most of our native bee larvae are going to spin a cocoon around itself and prepare to go through metamorphosis into the adult stage. This is called their pupa stage. Those larvae that don't spin a cocoon depend on the cell lining provided by the mother to protect it, such as you see in the picture of the polyester bees. Most bees spend 85% or more of their lives inside that dark natal nest, emerging from the nest fully formed and full grown. You are never going to see immature bees outside of their nest. And while bumblebees on the zinnia here in the photo in the upper right may look like mama and baby, they're actually 2 full-grown adult bumblebees, probably a queen next to an adult worker or male. The majority of our bees are active as adults for only 3 to 8 weeks. Native bees live and nest in all sorts of social arrangements, but almost all of them, 90%, are solitary. They have only 1 generation each year, and the single female does all the work to build and provision her nest. There are some solitary bee species that'll nest in dense aggregations, where there are many bees nesting in a very favorable area, but they're each tending their own nest. There are some communal nesters that'll share a common entrance, but provision their own brood cells. We have a few sweat bee species that are semi-social, with daughters from the first generation helping to care for 2 or more generations in a year. And then we have bumblebees, which form annual social colonies that have a queen bee and several generations of daughters to help tend the nest in a year. About 15% of bee species are kleptoparasites. Well, what the heck is that? Well, they're called cuckoo bees. And just like the cuckoo bird, they steal into the nest of a host species, laying her eggs in those brood cells. 70% of native bees nest in the ground, They are all around us, but we rarely notice them because they simply don't bother us. Most of our ground nesting bee species prefer loose, well-drained, bare or sparse soil, but there are also digger bees that may choose hard-packed clay. Some species nest in flat areas, and others are going to prefer earthen banks, but it's usually in a sunny spot and it's not typically in your richer soils. Most of the other 30% of our native bee species construct their nests in small tunnels, such as hollow plant stems or abandoned beetle holes in wood. Now, unlike most tunnel nesting bees that use existing tunnels, the female carpenter bee bores holes to lay her eggs. To make a tunnel nest, a female bee builds partitions to divide the tunnel into a row of brood cells. And depending on the species, the partitioning walls may be constructed of mud, plant resins, leaf pieces, flower petals, or secretions like wax or a cellophane-like material. These partitions protect the developing bee and its food from drying out, as well as excess moisture, fungi, and diseases. Now, the mother bee and all mother bees can control the sex of the egg. A fertilized egg with the chromosomes from both parents will be a female, and an unfertilized egg with just the chromosomes from the mother will hatch into a male. And she's going to start each tunnel nest with females and then complete the tunnel with males. The males emerge first in spring. They go get a quick energy drink, and then they come back and they wait close by for the females to come out. And then that mating is going to happen almost right away. During the 4 to 6 weeks that these adult female bees in the video are active, they can produce 1 or 2 eggs each day, laying about 30 eggs in her lifetime. Now, our social bee species are opportunistic, nesting in found cavities. The bumblebee builds honey pots in dry cavities in the ground, such as maybe abandoned mouse dens or tussocks of grass, or maybe under a hollow log. And the queen produces wax from glands in her abdomen to form the round pots for storing nectar and pollen, as well as brood cells to lay her eggs. There are feral honeybees that'll use hollows in trees or other structures, but most honeybees are domesticated and live in man-made boxes. Both bumblebees and honeybees are social bees, and they will protect their colony, so it's best to avoid their nests. Family names are commonly used to describe groups of bees because they generally have several traits in common. And in the mid-Atlantic area, we'll see bees in the 5 families that are listed here. And even though bees will vary greatly in size and appearance within a family, the relative length and form of their tongue is an important common trait because the tongue determines which flowers they're best adapted for foraging on. This little green sweat bee has a short tongue, believe it or not, whereas bumblebees can have much longer tongues that they keep folded under them when they're not using them. Here are examples of the 5 different families of native bees that are found in Maryland. The Halectidae family are known as sweat bees. The Andrenidae bees are called mining bees. The Callididae family are called polyester bees. And the bees in the Megachilidae family are generally known as leafcutter bees. Now, the Apidae family doesn't seem to have a common name, but that might be because so many of the genera within this family do, like the carpenter bee that you see in the picture. We also have honeybees, bumblebees, squash bees, and digger bees are all in that same family. Now, let's explore 1 or 2 examples each of these families just a little closer because they're all so very interesting. Bumblebees in that Apidae family come in different sizes and markings, but all 14 species here in Maryland have a very rotund shape, and they make a buzzing sound when they fly. They are generalist foragers that'll fly from early spring to late fall, even in cool, drizzly weather. And the bumblebees nest in cavities in or underground, forming that annual social colony, with only the late season mated females living through the winter to be next year's queens. The queen's daughter helped to raise the rest of the brood, and they can have several hundred brood cells by the end of the summer. These bees are very important for agriculture because they'll buzz pollinate crops with closed anthers, such as our tomatoes and our blueberries. They disengage their wings from their flight muscles and they vibrate them, and it drops that pollen right out of those closed anthers. Bumblebees are commercially raised and shipped for pollinating greenhouse crops, and that's mostly going to be our tomatoes, our cucumbers, and our strawberries. All carpenter bees excavate tunnels, then they use chewed pith or wood to divide their brood cells. This large eastern carpenter bee is our largest native bee and well known for chewing nest cavities in wood. Looks similar to a bumblebee, but it's larger with a shiny, almost hairless abdomen. And they're important for pollinating many crops, such as passion fruit, such as you see in the video, as well as blackberries and peppers. And here in the lower left, we've caught one in the act of being a nectar thief. It's chewing a hole in the side of the flower to rob its nectar without rubbing across any pollen. Small carpenter bees in the Ceratina genus are among our smallest bees. They're only about the size of a grain of rice. And she lacks the jaw strength to chew in solid wood, so she nests instead in the pithy centers of dried perennial stems. In fact, those stems need to be broken open in order for her to get access inside. And she is so cool. When she's done filling this nest, she places herself as a guard at the entrance, and she dies there, but she remains blocking that nest through the winter. Sweat bees are tiny to medium-sized bees that got their name because they could be attracted to the salts in human sweat. And most of our sweat bees are generalist foragers that nest in the ground. Some of the species are semi-social. They can have 2 or more generations in a year. And those nests can often become large, complicated mazes with up to about 100 cells by the end of the summer. Our sweat bees all have short tongues, and they forage on open flower forms where pollen and nectar are easy to access. In the Southwest, the farmers have been very successful at using alkali sweat bees for pollinating those large alfalfa seed fields. This is an area that's not favorable for bringing in the honeybees. So they create these salt flats surrounding those fields, which attracts dense aggregations of those alkali sweat bees. And although there are sweat bees worldwide, those beautiful green metallic sweat bees are only found in the Americas. Mining bees are tiny to large size, solitary ground nesters found in all types of habitats, and some species may even nest in lawns. But don't worry, their stinger is so weak it won't penetrate human skin. They typically prefer sandy, loose soil or areas near or under shrubs. And a few of these species may nest in those large congregations when conditions are just right. They usually burrow straight down, then construct their brood cells radiating out from that central shaft. And the mining bees use an oily secretion to line their burrow and the brood cells, and that helps stabilize the soil. You can usually tell the mining bees because their scopa hairs are high up on the upper part of their hind legs and even onto the side of their thorax. A large percentage of our mining bees are those specialist foragers. And like bumblebees, mining bees are able to buzz pollinate crops and are important for pollinating berries, tomatoes, and asparagus. The Calididae family of bees is the most diverse family, but none have been developed for commercial pollination. These Calites bees are small to medium-sized solitary ground nesting bees that typically have a heart-shaped face, and they have this extremely short tongue that's split into 2 lobes at the end. They're commonly called polyester bees or cellophane bees or plaster bees, and they're named for a waterproof material that the female secretes to line her burrow. She uses that lobe tongue like a paintbrush to apply her waterproofing to the nest walls and the cells. Because they have that very short tongue, they tend to prefer to forage on plants that are in the aster and the carrot family. Many of these bees like to build horizontal nests in vertical surfaces, so they'll nest in the root balls from fallen trees or along riverbanks, since their nests can withstand periodic flooding. And frequently, they'll put a polyester membrane that guards the nest entrance, kind of like a little doggy door. The Helias genera, or mast bees, nest in hollow stems, and they are unique in that they have no pollen-collecting hairs. The female bees do collect pollen and nectar to take back to their nest, but they take it back internally in their crop, or what's called a honey stomach. And last, but certainly not least, we have the bees in the Megachilidae family, which are unique in two ways. The females all have their scopa hairs on the underneath of their abdomen, and they collect pollen dry. And unlike other bees that build their brood cells using secretions, all the bees in this family construct their brood cells out of foreign materials. And the common name for each genus in the family frequently identifies her chosen cell lining. The mason bees use mud, the carder bees use wool-like plant fibers, the resin bees use plant resins, and of course, the leaf cutters use pieces of leaves. Now, only about 25% of the bees in this family are actual leaf cutters, so I tend to call them the hairy belly bees. The leaf cutters tend to hold their abdomen tilted up to keep that dry pollen from rubbing off, and she'll use her strong mandibles to cut specific size pieces of leaf to fit around their entire brood cell rather than just dividing walls. She'll do oval pieces for the sides and circular pieces to close the cells. And yes, she does seem to prefer the red buds and the roses for her building material. The introduced European alfalfa leaf cutter is raised commercially and distributed for pollinating those large alfalfa seed fields. Mason bees are a superstar pollinator in that family of bees that has the hairy bellies. And they are gentle, solitary, non-aggressive tunnel nesting bees that use mud to construct their tunnel nests. They are in a class by themselves when it comes to pollinating any early blooming fruit tree or berry bush. And surprisingly, their efficiency at pollination is due to their lack of efficiency at storing pollen to take back to their nest. The mason bees zigzag back and forth between the trees, and they belly flop all over the flowers, rubbing that dry pollen under the scopa hairs on their bellies, and they leave substantially more pollen behind on flowers than other bees do. The blue orchard bees, or bob for short, are commercially raised and distributed across the country for orchard pollination. For each foraging trip, she visits about 75 flowers, and it takes up to 25 trips to make one full pollen load. So she visits almost 2,000 flowers for each baby bee. Unfortunately, our native mason bees are being displaced by the more aggressive horn-faced bees that were introduced from Japan back in the 1960s to pollinate the apple orchards in the state of Washington. These are the two most important bees for agriculture, and they could not be any more different. The mason bee and the European honeybee are just like Felix and Oscar in The Odd Couple. The mason bees are solitary, where each female does all the work to construct and provision her nest, whereas the honeybee colonies have a queen with tens of thousands of daughters tending and defending her hive. The mason bees have that 1-year life cycle, taking a year to mature from egg to adult, so they're only active in spring. Honeybees are active all year round, and it only takes about 21 days to go from egg to adult. The mason bees forage in poor weather conditions, such as cool, cloudy days. Those honeybees are a bit more finicky. They're going to stay in the hive until the weather turns nicer. The female mason bee has to locate all of her possible forage, and she's only going to fly about 300 feet from her nesting area. The honeybee colony has scouts that'll search for good food sources, perhaps miles away, then give directions to the foragers in the nest using her waggle dance. The mason bee has an erratic method of foraging where she's jumping from tree to tree and crashing into the flowers. The foraging honeybee is highly meticulous. Is going to visit every flower along a branch before moving on to the next one. And the mason bees have those scopa hairs on her abdomen that readily pick up and brush off pollen grains all over the bloom. Whereas the honeybee mixes collected pollen with nectar and saliva and packs it into those pollen baskets, which means far less pollen reaches other flowers. So consider this. Say you have an acre of flowering fruit trees in an orchard. The standard is 2 honeybee hives per acre for orchard pollination. So that's 40 to 60,000 honeybees or more to fully pollinate all those blooms. About 250 female mason bees will do the same job. The mason bees have a 95% pollination rate, where honeybees have a pollination rate between 5 and 30%, depending on the flowers in the landscape. This is surely surprising, but remember that honeybees have to build huge stores of honey to survive the winter. That's something our native bees don't do. So honeybees are usually going to collect either pollen or nectar on any single foraging trip. And they'll frequently rob the nectar when they're out foraging for that, rather than touching the flower's reproductive parts. So for early spring orchard pollination, there's no question. Mason bees provide far superior cross-pollination. This is a little ironic since most orchard trees are propagated by grafting, so we're not benefiting from that exceptional cross-pollination service. But the ability to transport huge honeybee colonies to crops throughout the entire growing season over great distances makes them the most overall effective pollinator for our large-scale agriculture today. And what they found is that when you bring honeybees to an orchard and you have mason bees foraging side by side, the honeybees do tend to get a little bit sloppier and their pollination rate goes up. It's difficult to tell bees from wasps since they're so closely related. Shortly after the flowering plants evolved, our bees diverged from wasps through evolution. They're basically the wasps that went vegetarian. But I use their shape to tell the difference. The wasps tend to have that slender profile with a very narrow waist, while the bees are more robust. The bees typically are hairy, while the wasps are not. But the real tell for me is that the wasps all have those long, spindly, hairless legs. Now, unlike social wasps, such as paper wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets, the wasps showed here are all solitary wasps. In fact, the vast majority of wasp species are solitary, which are very beneficial for pest control and very unlikely to sting people. Now, for the bad news, our native bee populations, like most animals worldwide, are disappearing at an alarming rate, and there's several known causes for the decline in our bees. The greatest risk of all is habitat loss and fragmentation. As we alter landscapes for commercial properties, suburban lawns, agriculture, and other land development, there's ever diminishing resources for our pollinating animals. And this is where most people can really make a difference. Pesticides can kill bees either directly or over time from prolonged exposure. It could affect their reproduction, or it could kill all the plants that they need to survive. And with bees, that poison is frequently transferred to the developing insects in the nest through that collected pollen. The mass raising of bees for commercial distribution, such as our honeybees, our bumblebees, our mason bees, and our leafcutter bees, has resulted in the introduction of alien viruses and other diseases, and parasites such as mites that our wild populations haven't been exposed to and haven't developed any resistance to. The introduction of non-native insects frequently outcompete our native species for those diminishing habitat resources. It's considered a rule of thumb that a honeybee colony requires a full acre of flowering trees, shrubs, and herbaceous flowering plants for that hive to thrive. And as social bees, they're more aggressive and they'll outcompete most native bees. And as if all that isn't enough, climate change can break the synchronous relationship between specialist bees, whose timing is based on warmth, and their host plants that are responding to timing based on sunlight. The good news is that it's really easy to help protect our bees. And the best way to help is to establish safe habitat for them that provides the food, water, shelter, and space they need to reproduce, and to have undisturbed patches of this habitat close together. And as always, avoid using pesticides. And we're going to talk a little bit more about providing each of these important habitat elements. The main characteristic to consider with habitat location is that the site be in full sun for at least part of the day, and that be mostly open. The ideal here is to have nesting and forage and shelter resources all in the same area. For pollen and nectar food sources, plant a variety of trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, and herbs. And plant your perennials, annuals in clumps of maybe 3 to 7 plants, forming a really nice mound. And choose diverse plant groups with different sizes, shapes, and colors. Plan for your gardens to provide food throughout the entire growing season, from early spring through late fall. And if those good forage plants also happen to be weeds, consider leaving them as a resource for the pollinators before cutting them. Native plants provide the best food source for native pollinators due to coevolution, and most native bees have a preference for the pollen from our native plants. Those native plants offer a number of advantages for us as well. In general, they're less likely to require pesticides. They don't require fertilizer. They don't need as much water. They're not going to become invasive. Oh, yeah, we've got some thugs out there that can be pretty darn aggressive, but technically they're not invasive. And the native plants are so incredibly important because they promote that native biodiversity that's essential for an ecosystem to function and provide the services that we depend on, such as clean air, clean water, the food we eat, and so much more. That's why it's so important to encourage those functional ecosystems on our properties. Straight species tend to have more abundant resources for all of our pollinators over those fancy cultivars. And the exception to this would be the plants that have been cultivated for disease resistance. There are countless good choices of native plants to support our bees and other pollinators, and several reliable sources for recommendations, such as the University of Maryland Extension website, the Xerces Society, the Pollinator Partnership, and the Maryland DNR, just to name a few. My personal favorite is the National Wildlife Federation Plant Finder that recommends native plants for your area based on your zip code and how supportive they are for our local wildlife. Remember, right plant, right place. If the growing conditions are right for a plant species, it will perform well without much help. And no matter what your light or soil conditions, there's a native plant that can thrive there. Again, choose the straight species if possible, rather than the fancy cultivars, especially those with double blooms, because that's always at the sacrifice of the plant's reproductive parts. And be sure that the plants and seeds that you purchase have not been treated with systemic insecticides. Shop at trusted nurseries where you know your plants are safe. The flowers that bloom in early spring are a critical resource for those early emerging bees, such as our new bumblebee queens, the mining bees and mason bees. If you have a shady area, the ephemeral natives, such as the spring beauty, the Virginia bluebell, and the columbine, are beautiful flowers with great resources that do well in shade. And although they're not typically native, spring bulbs can provide a much needed early season energy source. The bumblebees and the honeybees seem to really like the grape hyacinth for early spring, and then all the bees like the alliums just a little bit later. But the best resources are our early native flowering trees, such as our native red maple, the native willows, the eastern redbud, the wild crabapple, and the black cherry. All are great early season food for our bees. Now, when planting your vegetable garden, be sure to add flowering plants to lure more native bees in, and that's definitely going to increase your yield. There is such an abundance of lovely native summer blooming perennial plants with plenty of resources for our bees. Some of those that we found were particularly good in the Ag Center demonstration garden are the Asclepias, the Gaillardia, the Monarda, the Liatris, the Lobelias, and the Etruchium. But there's so many to pick from. Now, Echinacea is not native to the mid-Atlantic area, but it is an easy to grow composite that's very attractive bees. So we say yes to cone flowers. Fall blooming plants are, again, very important energy source for our late season pollinators, especially the late season bees that have to survive the winter, such as our bumblebees that are going to become next year's queens. They have to build up their fat stores so they can survive the winter without starving. So plant your asters and your goldenrod and have a stunning display when the rest of the gardens are looking really tired and done for the season. A couple of other of my favorites would be the horsemint, which is the Monarda punctata, and the Vernonia, which is the New York ironweed. Our native helianthus, the perennial sunflowers, such as the thin leaf or the oxeye you see here, are especially good autumn pollen nectar sources, and they're host plants for several of our specialist mining bee species. Annuals can provide a wonderful source of pollen and nectar all season long and well into late fall. Some favorite annuals for bees are our zinnias, our cosmos, our salvias, our sunflowers, and herbs and mints. Now, you do have to let them bloom, the herbs and mints, and the mints some of them can be real spreaders, so you might want to put those in containers. Provide a safe place for your bees by keeping some untidy corners and piles of woody debris and pruned stems. If possible, leave your snags standing and logs on the ground. These are great shelter and nesting opportunities. Shelter is especially important during those times when bees are inactive, so protect their overwintering sites by putting off a fall cleanup. A gentle spring cleanup is much better for all the beneficial insects that are trying to survive the winter. Now, you can cut back your perennial stalks in the fall after the birds have eaten the seeds. Cut them 12 inches to 15 inches, and then those stalks will be used the following year for bee nesting sites. The new growth in spring is quickly going to hide that leaf cover and the stalk stubble from people, but the bees will find it just fine. The most important nesting areas to provide for bees are undisturbed areas of sparse or bare ground, and small areas are just as beneficial, especially if they're near clumps of flowers, but they do need to remain undisturbed until after the young adults have emerged the following year. There are so many options for creating the tunnel nesting sites, such as drilled dead trees or wooden blocks, or structures with bundles of those commercial cardboard bee tubes, or reeds or hollow perennial stems. And it's better to have several small structures near your early blooming flowers than a large structure. Mulch with compost or shredded leaves instead of wood and bark chips, and this is actually going to improve your soil by releasing the nutrients back as they break down. And avoid tilling. Not only does it break down the soil structure and dry it out, but it also disrupts the beneficial microbes that are necessary for healthy plant growth. Tillage also destroys the nests of shallow ground nesting bees, and specialists like squash bees like to build their nests in the ground very near their host plants. And please, please, please leave your leaves in the gardens. All sorts of important beneficial insects are trying to survive the winter under that leaf cover. And finally, consider replacing areas of turf grass with beneficial habitat. Turf grass provides no food value or shelter for your pollinators. The only thing you're feeding here are Japanese beetle grubs. If having a lawn is important to you, consider setting your mower blade higher, such as 4 inches, and letting the clover and dandelions or violets bloom before cutting. Better yet, replace an area of turf grass with a native tree surrounded by a native ground cover, such as the Tiarella cordifolia you see in the picture. These are foam flowers. You plant them out to the drip line, and as the tree matures, you allow the ground cover to expand out, always out to the drip line. And once that ground cover has filled in, you leave that entire area undisturbed. And this is the perfect way to improve your yard with a healthy, beautiful space for supporting wildlife. In addition to providing safe habitat, another good way to help bees is to talk about them with family, friends, and neighbors. Make sure that people know how important bees are and how important it is to provide healthy habitat for them. Other ways to help might be to install and maintain a pollinator garden in a public space, such as a school, a church, or a library. Maybe you could coordinate a corridor of pollinator gardens with your neighbors. And learn how to use integrated pest management, which is a technique for controlling pests without toxic chemicals whenever possible. And the Maryland Extension Home and Garden Information Center website can help you with non-toxic ways to control pests. For more information, there are many excellent resources on our native bees and other pollinators, along with essential gardening techniques to help support them. All these materials were used for the content in this program, but a couple of particularly enjoyable reads were Our Native Bees by Paige Embry and The Mason Bee Revolution by Dave Hunter and Jill Leitner. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to our native bees in Maryland and are inspired to help protect them. Remember, it's easy to support native bees by planting native flowering plants in our properties to bloom during the entire growing season, leave areas undisturbed for shelter, avoid pesticides, and be sure to spread the word that we need bees.